Good morning and welcome to the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's webinar on the Office's new Climate Change Report, Climate Action in Ontario, What's Next? My name is Nancy Pilardi and I'm the Senior Manager Climate Change here at the Office of the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. I will introduce Diane Sachs, the Commissioner, shortly. Today's webinar will present highlights from our Office's recent annual Greenhouse Gas Progress Report, which we released last week. Before we hear from Commissioner Sachs, a few technical details. We expect that the presentation will take about 40 minutes, followed by some time to answer questions from the audience. You are invited to submit questions at any time using the question and answer pane on the GoToWebinar window. If you don't see the question pane, click on the orange arrow in the top right corner of your screen to expand the control panel. We will hold questions until after the Commissioner's presentation, and then we will try to answer as many questions as possible in the time provided, and we will stay here for a few minutes past 11:30 if need be. The webinar will be recorded, and we will email it to all participants along with the slides shortly after the presentation. The webinar and slides will also be available on our website at eco.on.ca, where you can download the full report. I'd now like to introduce Commissioner Sachs to present some of the highlights from our report. Welcome, Commissioner.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. As I think you all know, I'm a nonpartisan officer of the Ontario Legislature. I'm appointed by all parties, and it's part of my job to report the truth about Ontario's progress on fighting climate change, just as its impacts begin to hammer us. The short answer is that until June, although we had lots to criticize in what the government was doing, Ontario was generally on the right track. Now, we are not. But even without with cap and trade, Ontario can still choose sensible solutions that will build a sustainable economy, improve public health, keep more money in the province, and help families make ends meet. But time is very short, and government choices matter. Hang on, we're going to slides somehow. Okay, so that's who I am. And as you all know, I report every year, I must report to the legislature every year on at least these three topics, climate change, energy, and environmental protection. So this is the new report from last week. This is the table of contents, the 5 main chapters, which we will walk through quickly in this webinar. I'd also encourage you to look, we did also post the press conference last week, which included my remarks. We tried to summarize what our takeaways here in a way that we hope will be of interest. Don't have time to repeat those now. The 5 chapters, first of all, we're tracing what has already happened and why we, again, need a new climate policy. And the rest of the report is about how to build a new climate policy, starting with how to establish commitment and credibility, the tools available for reducing emissions, and then the other whole half of the problem, which is adaptation, getting ready for what's coming, and a summary of our key recommendations. We've also got some great appendices. Some of them are in the printed report, which will be available this week. We also have all of the appendices online, starting with A is simply a menu of some of the policy tools that can be used to fight climate change, many of which we've already reported on in our previous reports. Appendix B is what was being done with the money from cap and trade. There was some suggestions that were made, particularly during the election, that the money was being used wastefully or misused or used unfairly, and that's not what we found. And so if you want to know, we've got a little bit in here, but if you want more details about what was actually being done with that money, how it was helping people and communities all across Ontario, it's in Appendix B. Appendix C gives some of the information about what has happened so far in Ontario to try to start getting ready for what's coming. There have been some efforts, but not nearly enough and not well coordinated. Appendix D is more of a technical piece. It's really what's happening in precipitation in Ontario. There's been a lot of concern raised by some parties suggesting that maybe, unlike the rest of the world, Ontario is not seeing increased intensification of rainfall. We don't think that's accurate. Appendix D gives you some of the statistical background on what we know, what we don't know, and how much we're harmed by the dramatic slashing of weather monitoring in Ontario and Canada. And finally, Appendix D, this is for modelers. We commissioned a special economic model to say, what are the least expensive ways for Ontario to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, build a sustainable economy over time, and the details of that are in Appendix E. So Chapter 1, or at least the first part of the report was why Ontario again needs a climate policy. As you can see, climate disruption already affects Ontario and it will get worse. We have 6 chapters within this section, and this is roughly what they cover. Bottom line, hopefully you all know climate change is here now. It's not just about polar bears. It's not just about people in other places. It's not even just about our children and grandchildren anymore. It's already here and it's affecting us now. So we know that Ontario is warming faster than the global average, or at least the statistics show us this. It's not well understood by many people in Ontario. I hope you know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the major global effort to develop science on climate change, will be releasing its major report on the 1.5 degrees target later this, October 8th, I guess, in about a week. So this is the question as to whether global warming for the world as a whole can be kept to 1.5 degrees this century, which is during the life of today's toddlers. But Ontario is already warmer than that, and we're expecting much more warming than that here. So just in the next 30 years or so, we can expect 2.5 to nearly 4 degrees additional warming on top of the 1.5 we've already had. And we can already see the phosphate season changing, although it changes in different places in Ontario. So one of the things you won't hear me talking about is global warming, because people tend to misunderstand that phrase to mean that everywhere is always warmer, especially when you'd like it to be warmer, like when it's cold. Now, although we have trapped an awful lot of extra heat in the world, and I can't go through my basic climate science presentation this morning. For those who are interested, it's still on our website and on our YouTube channel from last year. I'm also available to come out to groups and give it again. But the gist is that the greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere, they do trap a lot of extra heat. They're going to trap much more heat. And so the world as a whole, on average, is warmer. But that doesn't mean that everything is warmer all the time, especially the places we want it. In fact, it means unevenly distributed temperatures and disrupting natural cycles and more damaging, more unpleasant extremes. We know that extreme weather didn't start with climate change, but climate change loads the dice. It makes it more likely that we're going to have weirder, wilder weather, which is tough for us and for the food we want to grow and the economies that we have. So we know that extreme events have already tripled. This isn't our evaluation. This is the Actuary's Climate Index for Canada, the United States, and it's only been updated to 2016. As you probably noticed, we've had lots of wild and crazy weather and other extreme events in the last 2 years. So here's a few examples in Ontario. This is into the summer of 2016. You might remember we had an extraordinary drought. Those red areas had extreme low water levels with many, many wells going dry, including many of the wells that the volunteer fire departments used to fill up their trucks. They have designated special wells, and the Quinte Conservation Area told me that every single one of the firefighting wells in their area went dry that summer. But that's not what happened in 2017. 2018, we certainly had some floods. Bigger issues were fires, the Parry Sound 33, just one of them. And then, of course, we had tornadoes, not just in Ottawa, although that's where most of the greatest damage was. And we know also that as climate change accelerates, there are and will be more and more impacts on human health. We get infectious diseases that are now able to survive and propagate in Ontario that never used to be able to. We see Lyme disease, of course, and you've probably seen this book, The First Epidemic of Climate Change, and I know people who've had their lives completely changed by Lyme disease. I gave a talk last week in Barrie. I asked people how many people in the audience had family members who had Lyme disease, and probably nearly a tenth of the audience put their hands up. I mean, it's really becoming an issue. Extreme weather events also affect human health. You might remember earlier this summer when there were dozens of deaths in Quebec linked to the extreme hot weather. And also poor air quality. We know that the largest threat to human health from air quality in most parts of Ontario these days, particularly urban areas, is the tailpipes of fossil fuel vehicles, which are creating significant levels of adverse air quality, which is harmful for human health. And then, of course, we've got lots of issues about water. So another way to look at this is always to look at money. We have a really clear increasing trend in Ontario, in Canada as a whole, in North America as a whole, in the world as a whole, but also specifically in Ontario, as insured losses just keep going up. So this chart, you'll see a couple of things. First of all, this is just insured losses, and we know that the uninsured losses, by and large, on average, are roughly as much again. So you can assume that the actual losses for everybody are about twice as high as they show on this chart. The second thing that you can see that it actually doesn't show clearly on the chart is that these are all constant dollars. There's no inflation in these figures. Third thing you might see is that the color of the lines after 2008 are different of the bars on the chart. And that's because until 2008, these are Insurance Bureau of Canada figures, and they used to report insured losses from all extreme events. But they don't anymore. Since 2008, they only report in this chart, losses from events where each event was over $25 million in losses. So there are many smaller events that don't even show on this chart. And even so, if you put those together, what's happening to insured losses in Ontario? One other thing I'd like to point out about 2018, anybody notice 2018 is not over yet? And even so, we've got losses higher than we've had any other year except 2013. Who thinks this might affect the cost of insurance? Who thinks this might affect the availability of insurance? And in fact, again, the Insurance Bureau has advised us that up to 10% of all Canadian properties may soon be too high risk for private sector flood insurance if protective measures are not taken to protect those properties. And so far, most of those protective measures are not being taken. So that's why we need a climate policy. Climate change is here. It's a whole world issue, but it's also a world for us. And we were, I found lots of things to criticize about what the government was doing, but we were generally on the right track. And in 2016, our emissions were the lowest since reporting began in 1990. As you can see, Ontario is the second largest greenhouse gas emitting province in Canada. In 1990, when reporting began, we were the largest, but since then, Alberta's emissions have continued to skyrocket. Ours went up and then came down again. But as you can see, we've really done something remarkable, which is that our greenhouse gas emissions have gone down while our population and our economy have grown. The gross domestic product is bigger than it has ever been. And that was considered impossible when I was a young lawyer, that we could have economic growth without emission growth, and yet we already had that happen. Where do our emissions come from? Well, this is how things were in 2016, and you can see most of our emissions were from transportation. Now there's two colors on this chart, and this is because, thank you, 3/4 of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions come from, which is most of our climate pollution, come from burning fossil fuels for energy. That's 3/4 of it. But there's another quarter that isn't, and that's important because when we talk about solutions, cap and trade mostly covered the greenhouse gas emissions from energy, and the technology that's available to reduce our emissions is mostly affecting the emissions from burning fossil fuels for energy. It's most important for industry. As you can see from this chart, nearly half of the greenhouse gas emissions from industry are from types of emissions or activities for which they do not yet have any technological alternative. Whereas for those of us who drive around in cars and heat our homes, all of us, or most of us, have technology alternatives. So quite different. Another thing that's important in light of the comments of the government is that more of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions are directly from individuals and less from heavy industry. And again, those industry ones, a number of those, they don't have technology alternatives. In terms of how we compare to 1990, you can see on the right-hand side, our big win was electricity. Electricity emissions were major sources of climate pollution in Ontario in 1990, and we have slashed those to a very, very low level. This is again 2016 numbers, but we know that in 2017, only 4% of Ontario's electricity came from fossil fuels, which is really remarkable. Industry also, their emissions were down. Agriculture stayed about the same. Everybody else's emissions were up, and the ones that were up the most were transportation. And the largest source of transportation emissions is all of us driving around. So the big win, taking coal out of electricity, also had enormous impact in improving air quality and improving public health. And as you can see in this chart, 2014 was the last year that we used coal to make electricity in Ontario. And that also helped bring our smog emissions down from 53 days in 2005 to 0 for the first time in 2014. Lots of other things helped get our emissions down, big improvements by industry. Codes and standards have helped a lot. Building code has got better, about 13% improvement in predicted energy efficiency in every 5-year cycle of the building code. We've also had great improvements in energy efficiency of appliances, so refrigerators, televisions, telephones, toasters. They're all much more efficient now than they were in 1990. We've had a significant progress from energy conservation programs, specifically those run by utilities in Ontario. We wrote about that in April in Making Connections. The Green Energy Act helped, better rules on land use. And in fact, Ontario had become an international leader on how to reduce climate pollution and was getting attention and starting to attract investment from around the world to build a green economy in Ontario. And then, of course, we had the climate law with cap and trade. Now, we can't say that that necessarily had a major impact in 2016 because cap and trade began January 1st, 2017, and we don't yet have official greenhouse gas emission numbers for 2017, other than we know that electricity emissions were cut in half from 2016 to 2017. But we know that cap and trade was starting to work. And from we describe in our report how we know, there's a lot of different things also that I've seen as I travel around Ontario, meeting with businesses, meeting with organizations, meeting with individuals, hearing about how much having a price on carbon as well as the opportunity to access money for solutions was galvanizing innovation, talent, cooperation, people finding good ways to do things that in many cases have been left languishing for a long period of time. We know that the cap and trade program, it only was allowed to operate for 18 months, but in that period of time it raised nearly $3 billion, all of which was required by a law to be used to reduce or support reductions in climate pollution in Ontario. From the information we've been able to get from the Ontario government, $1.9 billion of that was spent, or at least the checks were distributed to programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And here's some examples of where the money went. We know that 3/4 of the money went to public services funded by taxpayers like hospitals, social housing, municipalities, schools, universities. 19,000 social housing units received energy efficiency upgrades, which in many cases they had been waiting for a very long time. There were energy retrofits at 98 hospitals, 621 schools, 48 universities and colleges, 129 municipalities received funds. And all of these funds had matching money in one way or another. So we saw, for example, that the money that went to industry, for every dollar cap and trade money, the industries on average invested $4 of their own money to make their operations more efficient. Municipalities put in more than twice as much money. Small business put in 1.5 as much money. So it leveraged a lot of investment in Ontario. And when cap and trade was canceled, we were within days of seeing a major multi-million-dollar investment program funded by one of Ontario's major pension plans, plus a private investor, to start investing in emission reductions outside the cap sectors, so in agriculture, waste, and forestry. And we were within days of seeing that money. Now, we know that there's a lot of benefits to reducing use of fossil fuels. Ontario spends about $11 billion every year importing fossil fuels, and then has to do it again the next year, and then again the next year. And we're entirely dependent on international markets for the cost of those fossil fuels. So the cost goes up and down, but we can't control. We know also, though, that if we reduce our fossil fuels, we get better air quality. We get better human health. We have more money available. So one of the things that I talked about in my remarks last week, just think about the hospital in Elliott Lake. They got some money from cap and trade. They are going to save more than $300,000 every year in their operating expenses, so they're not going to spend so much on energy. Ontario hospitals are on track to save $60 million a year, which they were going to plow back into patient care. And we had a lot of the money being spent on Ontario businesses. So the Greater Sudbury Housing Corporation got $100,000 of cap and trade money, and they spent that money buying energy efficiency equipment from a small Ontario business, which is now allowing them to cut in half the cost of energy in those buildings, as well as make their residents much more comfortable and give them more dignified lives. We know it is the best path to a sustainable economy, more jobs, more GDP. We also had the clean tech sector, which was the fastest growing in Canada, generating nearly $20 billion in annual revenue, including $1 billion in exports, which had built up painfully over many years. 5,000 companies employing 130,000 people. So tremendous human health and economic benefits, as well as environmental ones. But that was then, and this is now. So all of this progress has been brought to a wrenching halt. Right now, we have no climate policy. We have the government has proposed to revoke our emission targets. There's no source of money being identified for our solutions. Climate polluters pollute for free. There's no consequences for non-compliance. And most of the losses are likely to fall on taxpayer-funded public services, as well as on First Nations and small businesses, and people who invested in Ontario in good faith. Bill 4 is in front of the legislature right now. I'll talk a bit about that in a little bit. It's got two parts. One part is to abolish most of the climate progress that the previous government had adopted, including cap and trade and the climate targets. It also retroactively eliminates emission reduction obligations. So who are the winners, and who won and who lost as a result? Anyone who defied the law and didn't bother buying emission allowances for their emissions, they're now good, because there are no consequences for them if they didn't buy any allowances. Whereas those who did in good faith do everything they could to comply with the law, they bought offsets or allowances, they invested in greenhouse gas reductions, especially if their competitors didn't. If they bought some of the allowances that the government sold, if they were market participants who are providing the liquidity for the market to operate, or in fact, California and Quebec, two of our largest trading partners, who got stuck at the end with about $250 million worth of Ontario allowances. That's all money that flowed into Ontario, but that meant those extra allowances, which now have no environmental significance, got dumped into their carbon markets. So it's the winners and losers aren't fairly allocated. And then, of course, we've got the clean energy contracts that were torn up. 752 of them, including 10 of them were projects that won an international competition that Ontario conducted to have the renewable energy built in Ontario at the lowest possible cost. It was a 2-year, highly intensive program to select the winners. There were 16 winners. 10 of those contracts have now been canceled. And most of those 10 had significant participation by First Nations. We want, as I reported last year, environmental justice has to be part of reconciliation with First Nations, and surely we want them to be economically independent. And these projects were going to give them jobs, revenue, as well as the possibility of some energy independence so that you can have local resilience when the grid goes down, and closer ties with their local municipalities. Anyway, all of those have just been tossed out the window. There is, of course, the federal carbon tax that is scheduled to be adopted January 1st. It is important. I already reported that, in my view, cap and trade was better for Ontario than the federal carbon backstop. But if we don't have cap and trade, certainly the federal backstop is much better than nothing. But we still could get better results for our province with a Made in Ontario framework, and there'll be lots of holes, lots of things that the federal policies won't do. So looking forward, how do we get a climate policy that works? What's gone is gone. Now what happens? And we've looked at, first of all, basic principles. The most important thing to get climate policy that works over time is stable policies that have time to work. You can't attract investment, you can't attract talent, you can't change an $800 billion a year economy, which is still 80% dependent on fossil fuels, in the mandate of a single government. It takes time and it takes predictability. So the best example of that is the United Kingdom Climate Change Act, and it's not perfect, but it can help with political stability and electoral accountability, and expert credibility is a big part of the story, and it does help provide some investor confidence. And this is the key thing they have, is they set legally binding carbon budgets way out into the future, 12 years ahead, and each of those budgets is tied to the mandate of a specific government. So the public can actually tell, where are we going? Are we on track? There's an independent, highly credible climate committee that makes sure the public knows the truth. They're the ones who propose the carbon budget. So far, every one of their proposed budgets has been adopted by Parliament, and they're the ones who check whether the government is actually doing what it has to do to stay within those targets. We could do that too in Ontario. And in fact, I think we should. Here is some of the key advantages of the UK model: the strong public consultation that led to the adoption of the Act, cross-party support, which has helped it survive changes in government from one party to Conservative and so on, legally binding emission targets set well in advance, the legally binding carbon budgets, legally required to stay within those budgets and to have a policy plan to show people how it's going to be done, the independent expert modeling so they know what works, and they also have, really critically, third-party emission reporting, as well as third-party reporting of vulnerability to climate change, and I will try to come back to that. Another thing that we have to have is public consultation. The public has to be involved. We, the public, are going to live with the consequences of climate change, and we're going to live with the economic and public health consequences of whatever we choose to fight climate change. So the Environmental Bill of Rights, it's the law, and it's the best way of giving people an opportunity to be heard on environmentally significant decisions. And there is no more environmentally significant decision of this government than what we do about climate change. The rest of the report is about, okay, so what kind of tools can the government use? Sorry, I should take a second here. And what we show in this part is, so first of all, if you look at the speech bubbles, can Ontario still meet strong climate targets with existing technology? And the answer is yes. We need better government policies. The 2020 target, probably not without cap and trade. But the 2030 target, the 2050 target, we commissioned a detailed model to show, yes, we can still meet those targets with existing technology. We don't need to hope for magic. These are technologies that we could adopt right now. And here are the basic elements of the part. The least cost pathway, that's the economic model. What's the cheapest way to get to a sustainable economy? The three-legged stool, ways of thinking about tools to get emissions down, and the three legs are polluter pay, investing in solutions, and regulating climate polluters. And then we give a brief example of how you could apply those three legs to freight, which some of you already know we wrote about in more detail last year. So what's the least cost pathway? This this drawing shows you the results of the model. The model says, all right, if we need to get to our targets, and you can see the big black dots at the bottom are the targets in our current climate law, which is still the law, and are still good targets, probably not stringent enough for the science as we now know it, but they're the law right now. They're the ones we modeled, and as you can see, we can still get there. But how do we get there? What this shows is where are our cheapest emission reductions, and the first ones are in electricity. Well, the first ones are in conservation. It's always best to conserve first. But then the second place is more clean electricity is going to be a cheaper way of providing emission reductions than almost anything else. And then the biggest chunk of emission reductions after electricity is going to be transportation. And we know that we already have a lot of technology to do that, electric school buses, much more efficient vehicles of many kinds, as well as active transportation. So this shows us what the cheapest economic pathway would be for the economy as a whole. And one of the key things is that means we need a lot more clean electricity, much more than the long-term energy plan provides for right now. And in fact, we've even lost some of the clean electricity that was counted in the existing long-term energy plan because the 752 contracts have been canceled. How can we get there? Well, the key options: making polluters pay, investing in solutions, and regulating polluters. So making polluters pay, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Cap and trade is a really good one. It's one of the most popular in the world. It's going to be adopted in the entire country of China for their electricity system, which is their major use of coal. We've seen it work in the United States, for example, for reducing acid rain. We've seen it work in the RGGI, the 9, now 10 regional greenhouse gas initiative states. We know it works, and it leads to innovation. It gives a financial incentive for people to reduce their emissions. And so one form of polluter pay or another, we're going to need it to get everyone's juices going. They also provide a source of money, and we know that we need money to invest in solutions. We had $2 billion a year that was coming in designated for climate solutions, and we see from Appendix B how much good it was doing. 550 organizations across Ontario received money just in those 18 months. And without that, what are we going to do? Where are we going to get the money to fund the low carbon investments Ontario needs? So what we show in our report is there are some other mechanisms. Low carbon government procurement is a good one. It's been shown in Europe to reduce government costs. The government is the largest single buyer in the interior economy. That's the provincial government, and then there, of course, there is the broader public sector, which also spends a great deal of money in Ontario's economy. And we know that low carbon procurement could have a lot of benefits. We can also phase out fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, why are we still paying people to pollute? Canada has given 3 formal international commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, or at least the inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, but hasn't done much of it. And as we reported a couple of years ago, Ontario still spends about $625 million every single year providing tax breaks for fossil fuels. And then we have to do it again the next year. And there are so many better ways that we can use that money. If we use that money, for example, the $90 million a year roughly that we give people to subsidize the cost of heating their homes with oil, we could use that money to reduce what it costs them to heat their homes and making their homes much more efficient. And then the next year, we wouldn't have to give them $90 million again to subsidize the cost of oil, all of which goes out of the province to foreign oil providers. So here's an example of some of the things we could do with that money every single year. Then there's private investment. We know that the government doesn't have enough money by itself to pay for the kind of transformation of Ontario's economy that we know we need. It does take private investment. We were getting private investment. Ontario was very prominent in private investment. And there's trillions of dollars around the world looking for opportunities to invest in the green economy. And we were right at the front of the line. Now we're not. We're still going to need private investment. How are we going to get people to come back to Ontario after all the losses that have just been imposed from private investors? Well, it's not going to be easy. But we can't give up on it because we really do need the investment and the jobs that it brings. But if we're not going to have polluter pay, and we're not going to have investing in solutions, all that's left is regulations. And regulations in most jurisdictions do most of the heavy lifting, and we know they can work. They tend to be more expensive for the economy. But if that's all we've got, that's what we've got. That's what we're going to need. So here's, again, a very brief example. You know, we reported last year, freight is the only subsector in Ontario whose greenhouse gas emissions has doubled since 1990. Freight is also a major source of black carbon, which is not a greenhouse gas, but also a serious short-term climate pollutant. So how could the three-legged stool help? If you think about it, the three key things that we need that the Ontario government might be able to do, because we can't control directly the efficiency of engines, that's federal, is we want people to buy when they buy new trucks, they should buy clean ones. Well, a fee-based system, which is revenue neutral, doesn't take any tax money, puts a charge on when you buy a dirty truck and uses that money to provide a grant to subsidize the cost of cleaning trucks. So we know that works to encourage, when people are about to buy a new truck, to buy a cleaner truck. So that's one end of the story, get more new clean trucks. The other end of the story is what happens to the old dirty trucks, because the oldest trucks are the dirtiest, they pollute the most, and it's really important to get them off the road, because old trucks can stay on the roads for decades. How do we get them off the road? Well, two key things that can do it. One is pollution limits, and we wrote about these in detail last year, and the second is cash for clunkers. Give people a little bit of financial help to get rid of their old trucks, get them off the road, then the new trucks can take more of the space. But the other thing we need to do is to also reduce the number of miles driven by trucks every year. And that's, as we showed last year, the major reason why freight emissions have gone up so much. And the best tool to do that is road pricing. Right, so I'd like to remind people, please, if you do have questions, please send them in for us. We'll be getting to questions shortly because I'm almost at the end of the slides. The rest of our report, well, Chapter 4 is all about adaptation. We know climate disruption is already starting to be here. We know much more is ahead. We can do a lot to get ready, and the province has to lead the way. Here's some of the key chapters. One of the ones I do recommend that you take a look at is section 4.6. We know remarkably little about where we are vulnerable, and we know remarkably little about what that's going to cost us. How can we make a good plan if we don't even know those things? This is just a reminder that good climate policy needs both sides of the coin. We can't just adapt. We won't be able to adapt to climate change if it's left unchecked. And it isn't enough anymore just to try to reduce emissions. We have to do both. We have to both reduce emissions and get ready for what's coming. Basically, you have the choice. We can pay less now or pay a lot more later. In fact, the cost of climate change, the damage from climate change, and the cost of adaptation could be enormously larger than the cost of mitigating damage. My mother used to tell me a stitch in time saves 9. Well, it's the same thing here. One of the areas that we know is much cheaper to do invents is save natural buffers, save woodlands, save wetlands. They protect us from many of the worst impacts of climate change, and yet we continue to lose them at an extraordinary rate. We need to know where we're vulnerable, and we need to have an honest conversation about who's going to pay. So remember, I told you that about 10% of Canadian properties will soon be ineligible for private flood insurance. What will happen then? Is it our idea that the owners of that property are just left alone? And if so, are we going to tell them that at any point? Or is it our idea that the taxpayer will be on the hook for people who don't take any precautions to protect their homes or their businesses and put them in dangerous places? Well, that isn't a good idea either, but we need to talk about it. We need an honest conversation, and so far, we've never had it. So here are 3 of the key things Ontario needs to have. We need to know where we're vulnerable and set priorities for what we're going to do about it. We need consistent, accessible data about what weather to prepare for. I hear this everywhere I go. Municipalities, engineers, they say, listen, we understand that the old weather isn't the weather anymore, but tell us what numbers to use. How much rain should we be planning for? How fast the snow melt? And so far, we don't have it. Our office has been reporting about that for years now. The Ontario government has set up an organization to provide this data, but it can't operate without funding. And we also need to encourage and incent everyone to increase our own resilience. We cannot rely just on government. It won't be enough. And people need to know what they need to do and what works. And they may need some help doing it. And none of that is happening so far. So how can Ontario rebuild a credible climate policy? Here's our framework for how to start. The key things, first of all, we have to have a good climate law that sets legally binding climate targets. We can keep the targets we've got, but they have to be legally binding, and we need a legal obligation to stay within them. And then when we know where we're trying to get to, how are we going to get there? What's the pathway? What are the parts of the economy where we need to see and can see emission reductions? Well, that's what the economic model is for. And then when we know that, okay, well, how do we make it happen? What tools do we use? We need real action and we need real policy tools. And that's that three-legged stool: polluter pay, investing in solutions, and regulation. And then we have to monitor and report. Transparent, credible reporting so people can really trust. Are we on track? If not, we need to adapt. And we need third-party validation and verification, or we won't get there. And at every step of the way, we have to consult Ontarians because we're all in this together. Government can't do it alone. So thank you very much. Oh yes, this. So what can we all do? I've said this many times. Number one, everybody, we've got to reduce our carbon footprint. Best estimate, we've got to try to reduce it at every scale, individual, as families, as organizations, as a province, 5% a year. And we can. We've got to get ready to adapt. And we have to speak up. And the opportunity to speak up, you'll be glad, is right now. Because there are two key bills in the Ontario Legislature which are open for public consultation on the environmental registry, and it really matters whether people speak up. Do you care about this or not? If you care about it, this is the time to be heard. The climate bill, Bill 4, is open for comment only until October 11th, and they're going to be having public hearings apparently the very following week, so there isn't going to be a lot of time. Please get your voices in. This is where you find it on the environmental registry. And please also send a copy of your comments to our office as well, and we'll be reporting on that to the public. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, we're glad to take them now. And please, if you don't already have the report, please get it from our website. If you'd like hard copies, as I say every year, we really need your help getting the report out to your networks, your colleagues. If you can mention it in your newsletters, tweet about it, that would be great. If you can use hard copies of either the full report or the summaries, please let us know. You can email commissioner@eco.onca, and we will be so delighted to send them out to you. We need your help. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. We'll now start taking some questions from our audience. As a reminder, you can submit questions using the questions pane on the GoToWebinar window. Once again, you can use the orange arrow to expand the control panel if you don't see this option. So our first question is, you ended with calling people to comment on Bill 4. What should I look for in a good climate law?
Well, we think it should look like this at least. We think it should be modeled on the United Kingdom law. So the key features there are legally binding, stringent, science-based targets consistent with the Paris Agreement, set well in advance because it takes time. People need to have certainty as to how they should invest. The target should be based on good modeling, ideally by independent, credible people like the Climate Committee in the UK. There has to be transparent progress reporting so that we can tell what we're doing. And then we need to use tools that work. And again, there really are only the three groups: polluter pay, investing in solutions, and regulations. That's all we got that really works.
So one of the questions that has also come in stays with Bill 4 and asks, what is the Premier's rationale for enacting Bill 4?
Well, I can't speak for the Premier. The government said basically that they campaigned on getting rid of climate cap and trade, and so they're getting rid of cap and trade. That's as far as I know. Perhaps you should ask him.
So we'll shift to the transportation sector. You talked a bit about that being the largest subsector, the freight. So a couple of questions have come in on the Drive Clean. So one is, will the cancellation, the recent announcement about Drive Clean, increase transportation GHGs? There's kind of a three-part. Without Drive Clean, how will we know how many old cars meet the emission standards?
So Drive Clean is interesting, and the government did actually consult me about Drive Clean before they canceled the personal vehicle part of it. Drive Clean has done enormous good for personal vehicles, but personal vehicles are different now than they were when the program started. And the number of cars that were caught in the last couple of years by the Drive Clean program is not being properly maintained was just a few hundred. It was quite small. So the cost of the program was about $40 million a year, and they had caught, I think, 300 or so cars in the entire year for that. It was much more bang for the buck in the part of Drive Clean that applies to heavy vehicles, and the government has pledged to keep that operating because heavy vehicles, as I indicated, they're fastest growing, they have the dirtiest emissions, and Drive Clean for the heavy vehicles being only recently. It's still a pretty weak program for the heavy vehicles. We think there should be more, but that's probably not where I'm expecting the big problems from increasing transportation, but that we do need lots and lots of action on transportation generally, and there's many other probably better things to do.
And so staying with the question on transportation, do you have any information about the progress of the Ministry of Transportation studies to electrify GO Train, and in particular feasibility studies for hydrogen versus over wire?
Well, I know that there has been a lot of work being done at Metrolinx on exactly this question. There are some areas of the Metrolinx lines that are very difficult to put wires in, in some cases because of the other users of the tracks, in some cases possibly because it goes to areas that are susceptible to flooding. There's also some real problems in Union Station as to whether there's simply enough room to put overhead wires. So there are many possible advantages to hydrogen. I did see an interview with the new CEO of Metrolinx saying that they're going to be reviewing that. So bottom line is, I understand that there's lots of discussion. We do know that the first hydrogen trains are now running on commercial schedules in Europe. The question I was asked last was whether or not the supply chains in Ontario could supply the equipment that we need fast enough for Metrolinx to build on schedule. And that I haven't heard a current answer to.
And the connection with electricity and transportation, given our current situation with the surplus of off-peak power, could you see a role for OPG and others to provide direct incentives for electrification of transport?
Well, I know that OPG and some of the other electricity providers are very interested in playing a larger role in the electrification of transport. It is, however, very important for people to realize that although we have lots of extra power at night and on the weekends in the spring and fall when it's not very hot and not very cold, we don't have a lot of extra power at night in the summer and the winter, and particularly in the summer when our peak loads are. So it's going to be challenging to tee all of that up. Well, it's one of the reasons why in our electricity report in April, which if you haven't read, you should, we talked about the really urgent need for more storage, including pump storage, which is the cheapest form of long-term storage that's available. And we have tremendous opportunity, massive capacity in Ontario for pump storage that we're not now using. But generally, do I think the electricity providers could play a big role in helping electrify transport? Absolutely, and we see it work, for example, in California, the electricity providers are playing a big role, and it's working well for them and for the public at large.
So I have two questions around government policy. One of them is, are you aware of any other government that went backwards like Ontario, but then was able to recover and implement good climate policies? And I just want to hook that with the next question is, can you give examples of policies that might be attractive to this current government?
Well, it's not for me to say what the government wants. It's my job to try to say what works. And but there are some things, there are certainly examples of other jurisdictions who have backtracked on subsidies for renewable energy. In Spain is a very well-known example. But I don't know of any jurisdiction that adopted cap and trade and then abandoned it And I don't know of any jurisdiction that adopted climate targets and abandoned them as Ontario is proposing to do. In terms of policies of the that might be suitable for this government, you know, the fee bait, for example, that we talked about, that's something that might be consistent because it wouldn't add to the provincial deficit. It's not a new tax. It's simply using a fee bait tool to encourage cleaner trucks to be purchased, which we know have many, many financial benefits. I think that given the concerns of the government about the deficit, they may be very interested in opportunities to dramatically reduce operating costs for public services that the province pays for, like schools and hospitals and you know, universities and so on. And so energy efficiency, the International Energy Agency has shown over and over again is generally the best bet, that maybe 30 to 40% of what we need to do in terms of our emission reductions can come from energy efficiency, and yes, save money doing it. The government may also be interested in things that help build jobs, good jobs in Ontario. I know that energy efficiency is, again, one of the best ways to do that. So, but I can't speak for them. I don't know what they're going to like. We tried to set out a pretty complete range of options and show some of the ways that is consistent with what they're interested in. One other thing that's worth thinking about is the short-term climate forcers. So we focus a lot in this report on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that is the focus of the Paris Agreement, which is, you know, the one agreement where the entire world has come together. But even more urgent than reducing greenhouse gas emissions is reducing the short-term climate forcers, because they have they do so much climate damage so quickly. And the big ones there are refrigerants and anesthetics, soot, black carbon from vehicles, and methane. And the Ontario government, you know, there was nothing in the election campaign about any of those, so there isn't anything obviously incompatible with their values or priorities to deal with those three issues, and they could deal with those three issues quite quickly and do a lot for climate action.
You spoke earlier about the gap on industrial emissions. Given the lack of technological alternatives, what are your comments and thoughts about what needs to happen with industry emissions that are not energy related?
Well, we looked at this again in more detail in the report that came out in April called Making Connections, Straight Talk About Electricity. I'd certainly encourage you to look at that. What we showed was that because it is so difficult, well, it's not just so difficult, right now it is not possible for many industries in Ontario to reduce their non-energy emissions. They simply don't have technological alternatives. And so we should be looking for more reductions where we do have technological alternatives, such as in transportation. For the industries in the long term, we are going to need alternatives for them. And so I also have strongly recommended that we should be investing in research. The Saskatchewan government, for example, has called for this, that we should be investing strongly in research and innovation to create alternatives for those industries. We know we're going to need it. And we've got lots of really bright people in Ontario. We could be working on that. We could also be cooperating with the federal government. They have some money also going into carbon capture and storage and things that, you know, aren't practical yet, but we really hope they will be eventually. And good people working on them might help.
So a couple of questions have come in on the Environmental Bill of Rights. One of them is from someone who has identified themselves as a representative from a school board. We would like to comment on Bill 4 and 34. The comment is that they benefited from cap and trade. The school boards benefited from cap and trade. What specific language would you recommend we include in our EBR comments? And to what extent can our comments help change the course of these bills?
Well, I haven't got a crystal ball, so I can't tell you how much the government's opinion can be changed. We have seen in the nearly 25 years of the Environmental Bill of Rights that when people don't speak up, generally the government just does what it's intending to do. When people do speak up, Government doesn't generally do a complete U-turn on what they've already committed themselves to do, but the details can change. And every once in a while, if people speak up powerfully enough, they do actually change their mind. And so a couple of recent examples have to do with the slaughter of endangered species. So as you may know, we have a law that we're required to protect endangered species. And in Ontario, until a year ago, the provincial government legally allowed the slaughter of two of those endangered species, or these threatened species in Ontario, the Algonquin wolf and the snapping turtle. And there was in fact, the government was proposing to make it even easier to slaughter the Algonquin wolf, which is unique to Ontario and part of Quebec. It's endemic, there's a small and shrinking population. And there was an enormous public response, and the government backed off. They abandoned their proposal to make it easier to slaughter the Algonquin wolf, and they finally, for the first time, made it illegal to slaughter the snapping turtle. So sometimes they do listen. We've also got lots of examples where the details of policy do get affected by public policy. So yes, it matters enormously whether people comment. In terms of how to comment, so a couple of the key things that we always recommend. First of all, please remember there are actual humans reading this. So don't put anything in there that you wouldn't say to the face of a civil servant who might be, your brother-in-law's next door neighbor. Be concrete, be clear, be really explicit as what it is that you're looking for. If you want to adopt our recommendations, we've got lots of recommendations in our report. Certainly worthwhile copying your MPP. It definitely helps to have other people sign with you. So if it's just a small group and the government can just dismiss you as being, well, it's just an elite, or it's just this, or it's just that, that's easier for them to ignore you. But if you're working together with, different kinds of folks, if you're working together with people who the Conservative Party might identify as their supporters, that may help. And also you may learn something if you talk about this with people who don't have the same point of view, and see if there is something that you can agree on in common. Those kind of conversations can be very, very helpful. But the main thing is be clear. If you need stats, as I say, our reports, this report and the last two, provide a lot of the statistics that you might need. And if you're looking for recommendations, we've been not shy at all about what our recommendations are, and if they work for you, please adopt them.
So we have a few questions.
Did I say that? Please do copy your MPP and speak to them if you can. And also remember, there's a municipal election coming just in a few weeks. So these issues are also very important. Municipalities are significant climate leaders. They affect many of the ways that climate change affects people. So, talk to your candidates for your municipal government as well.
So I see we're almost at 11:30. We will stay around for about 5 more minutes. We have a few more questions that are coming in still. So if you need to leave, you can get this, we'll email this, and you can always watch the last few minutes, but we will stick around for 5 more minutes.
And thank you everyone for the great questions.
So here's a question that you talked about, the importing of oil. If most of our oil comes from Western Canada, wouldn't pegging to international price apply more to imported natural gas?
So Ontario gets some oil from Western Canada. We also get some oil from other international markets. But my understanding is that the $11 billion does fluctuate with international markets. I mean, it doesn't fluctuate instantly. Not all of the fossil fuels bought in Ontario are bought on the spot market. Some of it's on long-term contracts as well. And the long-term contracts, the price doesn't change until the end of the long-term contract unless the contract provides price adjustments. But we certainly do see, natural gas, for example, was an order of magnitude higher in a little over a decade ago than it is now. It's at historically low rates. Will it or will it not stay at such low rates? That I don't know. Some of the U.S. projections suggest it will go up to some extent, higher than it is now, maybe not as high as it was in 2005. And oil prices bounce all over the place. So if we reduce how much fossil fuel we need, we will be less dependent on those markets. But exactly what the impacts will be, I'm afraid I can't answer.
Mm-hmm. So this is a bit more of just a technical question. What is the source of data on Ontario's GHG emissions?
Well, there are a lot of different sources of data that go into the national inventory, but when we say what the emissions are, we are using the national inventory, which is produced under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change by the Canadian government, and they do report separately for each province. That's why I can't tell you what the emissions were for 2017. And in fact, we probably never will know exactly how much cap and trade reduced emissions, partly because it's for an 18-month period, and partly because cap and trade was going to take time to change emissions, and partly because emissions go up and down every year for many factors that are not just to do with government policy. The weather is one, and there's a number of other things that go into it. But the Statistics Canada collects data in a lot of different ways. They get data from industries, they get data from questionnaires, they get data from tax revenues. We do every so often we meet with Statistics Canada to try to encourage them to improve the accuracy of their stats, and I know they're trying to do that.
So I'm going to take about 3 more questions because we are running out of time. Can you give more examples of where the money for incentives will or may come from?
Well, I can't tell you where they will come from. What we did do in the chapter on investing in solutions was look at possible places that they could come from. So, for example, we've had really good results from some of the utility programs in Ontario, and the natural gas utilities, they used to have fairly small programs, very small in comparison to the programs we've had for electricity. That has been improving, and the Ontario Energy Board is doing a review. Well, there's a midterm review right now about the conservation framework. There's a 6-year conservation framework for gas companies. It's got a midterm review right now, and so one of the things is, could those programs provide more money and support more reductions in at least fossil natural gas use? We have the possibility, for example, of municipal governments generating funds, perhaps from road pricing, for investing in local solutions. We've seen that work in some other cities around the world, and as you probably know from the C40 and even in the We Are Still in the United States, leadership by municipalities has had a huge impact on why the United States, even without the Trump government, is still on track for meeting its Paris commitment. There could be money from private investors if appropriate rules were established. The UK did see an increase in private investment after they set long-term targets. And there, for example, the government has committed itself to reducing gas tax, but they didn't commit themselves to reducing diesel tax. And diesel, as I said earlier, is a big problem for air quality as well as for emissions and for congestion on the road. So perhaps you might see an increase in diesel taxes that could provide both some incentive for emission reductions and some money for, say, a Cash for Clunker program. So there are things that could be done.
Do you think framing our actions as quote unquote systems change will help connect people to climate impacts and motivate people to act? If, for example, if they see the direct benefits to health, personal finances, etc.
Well, I certainly agree that one of the factors that is really, really important in motivating action on climate change is for people to see that it matters to them. It's the biggest gap in world understanding, that even most people in North America who understand about climate change, know that it's happening, know that it does, know that it's serious. According to polls, most of them still don't think it matters to them. And so that's one of the reasons why the first chapter of this report is all about why climate change matters to us here, even though other people will suffer more. I don't know whether talking about systems change motivates people very much, but recognizing the impact on children's health, their own health, on the opportunities to keep money here, make jobs here, that can be highly motivating to people. And sometimes we can get change motivated without talking about climate change at all. And I've mentioned last year the Conservatives for Clean Energy in the United States, who are in states where it's just not considered polite or wise to talk about climate change. So they talk about energy efficiency, and they talk about energy independence, and they talk about jobs, and they talk about local employment, and they talk about health, and they talk about all these other benefits for reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, and they get some of the same action going. So anything that allows people to get motivated, sometimes it's a moral discussion. And again, this is one of the reasons that I think the faith of the common good can be so helpful and so powerful, is get faith communities using the shared moral ground that a faith community comes together about to say, what is the right thing for us to do? How do we give our kids a better chance? Well, one of the things is make our buildings more efficient, carpool with somebody else to church, find ways to do what we can, speak up as an organization on these critical moments. We have to find other ways to have these conversations.
So I did say I'd allow 3 questions, so this will be the last question. The government axed many programs before the line-by-line audit was conducted at great expense. How can this be made clear to Ontarians, and what other recourse do people have beyond the environmental registry?
Well, we've done our best to try to make it clear. We've provided the statistics which were not previously made public. So we've given you the information. Now, how to have a conversation about it? I don't have a magic wand. There are the usual things. Can you write letters to the editor? Can you talk about it in your church? Can you mention it in a newsletter? Can you think about ways to have that conversation go on? Municipal election is a really good place to have that. Every time there's an all candidates meeting, are you there? Are you asking these questions? Those all candidates meetings sometimes get media. Are you good at social media? Are you good at writing songs? Write a song about it. If you're good at something, use it. I don't know, make baked cherry pies and put a message on the pie. Think of some original thing to do that gets your neighbors talking about it. Go to a farmer's market, talk to farmers, talk to people who are not the folks you talk to every day, and see if there's some common ground. And you know what? Get the kids talking about it. This is their lives more than ours.
Thank you, Commissioner. So that concludes our webinar on climate action in Ontario. What's next? As a reminder, the full report and the archived webinar will be available from our website at www.eco.on.ca. And we also invite your feedback on the webinar or any of the topics covered in the report. And you can email us at climate.change@eco.on.ca. And again, thank you for joining us this morning, and have a great day.